The laughter echoed through the marble lobby like shattered glass. Raymond Fletcher knelt on the polished floor, wiping up spilled coffee while 300 employees watched in silence. Above him, CEO Veronica stood on the stage, her perfectly manicured finger pointing through the floor to ceiling windows at the Bell 429 helicopter gleaming on the rooftop. "Fly this helicopter and I'll marry you," she announced, her voice dripping with mockery, and the crowd exploded into nervous laughter at the impossible challenge thrown at a janitor. Ray's calloused hand stilled on the mop handle, his jaw tightening as the humiliation washed over him like ice water. What Veronica didn't know, what nobody in that building knew, was that she'd just awakened something Ray had buried for 6 years, and her cruel joke was about to cost her everything she thought she understood about the invisible man in the grey uniform. The fluorescent lights of the 40th floor hummed their lonely song at 5 in the morning. Raymond Fletcher pushed his cleaning cart across the polished marble, the wheels squeaking in rhythm with his footsteps. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline was still draped in darkness, the city just beginning to stir beneath a blanket of early autumn fog. The chemical smell of floor cleaner clung to his uniform, a scent he'd grown so accustomed to that he barely noticed it anymore. Ray paused at the eastern window, his reflection ghosting back at him in the glass. Behind that reflection, perched on the rooftop like a sleeping predator, sat the company's newest helicopter. A sleek Bell 429 with Chase Aviation's logo gleaming even in the pre-dawn light. He stared at it longer than he should have, something tightening in his chest, a familiar ache he'd learned to ignore over 6 long years. At 42 years old, graying at the temples with hands weathered beyond his years, Ray had become an expert at ignoring things. Then he turned away, grabbed his mop, and got back to work. 3 hours earlier, Ray had been in his small apartment in Pilsen, a neighborhood where rent was almost affordable. The studio was cramped, barely 500 square feet, but it was clean because Ray made sure of that. The Murphy bed folded against the wall with sheets pulled military tight, and the kitchenette counter held a single coffee maker and a row of his son's drawings. Ray stood at the stove, scrambling eggs in a pan that had seen better days, watching Cole sleep on the pull-out couch across the room. At 8 years old, his son had his mother's dark eyes and Ray's stubborn chin. Cole stirred as the smell of breakfast filled the small space, rubbing sleep from his face with small fists. On the makeshift desk beside the couch, Ray noticed a new drawing, another helicopter colored in careful strokes of blue and silver. Cole had written across the top in uneven letters, "My dad's dream." Ray's throat tightened as he plated the eggs and brought them to the small table that served as dining room, homework station, and everything in between. Between bites, Cole looked up at his father with those serious eyes that sometimes seemed too old for his face. "Dad, do you think I can be a pilot someday?" Cole asked, his legs swinging beneath the chair. Ray set down his coffee mug, the cheap ceramic warm against his palm, and chose his words carefully. "You can be anything you want, buddy. Just work hard and never let anyone tell you you're not good enough." Cole smiled, his face lighting up with innocent pride. "Like you?" he asked, and Ray forced himself to return the smile. "Yeah, like me." But as he cleared the dishes and helped Cole get ready for school, Ray wondered if he was lying. Was he really someone to look up to? A janitor scraping by, living paycheck to paycheck? He pushed the thought away as he walked Cole to the bus stop, the morning air crisp with October's promise. Cole hugged him tight before boarding, and for that moment, Ray knew he'd made the right choices, every single one of them, because this boy was worth any sacrifice. By the time Ray reached Chase Aviation's headquarters downtown, the building was coming to life. Executives in tailored suits strode through the lobby, not seeing the man in the grey uniform who held the door open. Ray had worked here for 3 years, and he could count on one hand the number of people who knew his name. That was fine with him because anonymity was a kind of safety, a shield against questions he didn't want to answer. The office was a cathedral of glass and steel, 40 stories of ambition and aerospace innovation. Chase Aviation had made its fortune in helicopter technology, from medical transports to luxury private crafts. Their latest prototype sat on the rooftop helipad, a testament to engineering and excess. Ray had overheard the executives talking about it in hushed, reverent tones. $12 million, cutting-edge avionics, top speed of 180 knots. He knew those specs like he knew the back of his hand. He was finishing the executive wing when footsteps echoed down the hallway. Harry Walsh rounded the corner in his maintenance uniform, his weathered face breaking into a knowing smile. At 65, Harry moved with the careful deliberation of a man who'd earned his aches through decades of hard work. "Morning, Ray," Harry said, his voice carrying the gravel of a 2-pack-a-day habit he'd quit 10 years ago. "You're early again." Ray admitted he couldn't sleep, and something in Harry's eyes suggested he understood more than Ray had ever told him. At noon, Ray took his lunch break on the loading dock behind the building. He unwrapped the peanut butter and jelly sandwich he'd made that morning, the bread slightly stale but good enough. Harry joined him, carrying a thermos of coffee that he poured into 2 foam cups. "Big day today," Harry said, settling onto an overturned crate. "Company-wide meeting this afternoon. Veronica's announcing the new drone project." Ray nodded, thinking about Veronica Chase, the 35-year-old CEO who'd taken the company in aggressive new directions. At 3 o'clock, the lobby transformed into an auditorium as employees filed in from every floor. Ray positioned himself near the back, behind his cleaning cart, because he'd learned that if you stood still enough with a mop in your hand, people looked right through you. Veronica Chase emerged from the executive elevator precisely on time, moving with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her place in the world. Her suit was charcoal gray and perfectly tailored, and her dark hair was pulled back in a severe style. She commanded attention without asking for it. "Thank you all for coming," Veronica began, her voice amplified and crisp. "Today marks a turning point for Chase Aviation. We're not just building helicopters anymore, we're building the future of autonomous flight." The screen behind her lit up with renderings of sleek, unmanned aircraft. She spoke about artificial intelligence and efficiency with that clipped, confident tone of the perpetually successful. Ray listened with half an ear, his attention drifting to the windows where he could see the Bell 429 on the rooftop pad. Then it happened, the moment that would change everything. One of the junior executives stumbled near the stage, his coffee cup flying from his hand. It hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, exploding in a spray of dark liquid. The room went silent, every conversation cutting off mid-sentence. Veronica's expression didn't change, but her eyes swept the room until they landed on Ray. She raised one perfectly manicured hand and pointed directly at him. "You, janitor, clean this up, now!" Ray felt every eye in the lobby turn toward him like spotlights. He pushed his cart forward, the squeaky wheel suddenly deafening in the silence, and knelt beside the spill. His hands moved automatically, soaking up the coffee, wringing out the mop. He kept his face carefully neutral, because this wasn't the first time he'd been summoned like a servant. But Veronica wasn't done, and she stood at the edge of the stage looking down at him with an expression that might have been curiosity or contempt. "Imagine spending your whole life like this," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the lobby. "Cleaning up other people's messes, never creating anything, never achieving anything, just existing." The words landed like punches, each one carefully aimed. Around him, Ray could feel the discomfort of the employees, the awkward shifting of feet. Some looked away, unable to meet his eyes, while others stared with a mixture of pity and relief. But no one spoke up, and Ray kept working. Ray finished cleanings and stood, picking up his cart. He was turning to leave when Veronica called out again. "Wait!" He stopped but didn't turn around, his hands gripping the cart handle until his knuckles went white. Veronica walked to the window, her heels clicking on the marble, and gestured up toward the rooftop. See that helicopter? The Bell 429? It's a masterpiece of engineering. It takes years of training to fly something like that. She turned back to Ray, and her smile was sharp. Tell you what, janitor, you fly that helicopter and I'll marry you. Laughter rippled through the crowd, nervous and uncomfortable, but genuine. Veronica's assistant covered her mouth, shoulders shaking, while several executives chuckled openly. Ray stood frozen, his entire body rigid, and for a moment he let himself look up at that helicopter. The Bell 429 gleamed in the afternoon light, and Ray knew every inch of it. He knew the feel of its cyclic stick, the responsive bite of its anti-torque pedals, because he'd flown its predecessor through sandstorms and enemy fire. But that was another life, another man. Ray turned and walked away, the laughter following him like a ghost. He finished his shift in a blur, his mind circling around Veronica's words. By the time he clocked out, his whole body felt heavy. Harry found him in the locker room, his weathered face creased with concern. "Ray, I heard what happened," Harry said gently. Ray shrugged into his jacket, a canvas thing with a torn pocket. "It's fine, Harry. I've dealt with worse." But Harry stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. "You could show her. You could show all of them." "Show them what?" "That I used to be somebody." Ray shook his head. "That doesn't matter anymore." Harry's eyes were serious, understanding. "It matters to me, and it would matter to Cole." The mention of his son's name made Ray pause. He thought about that drawing on the fridge, about Cole's careful letters spelling out, "My dad's dream." What kind of example was he setting by accepting humiliation in silence? What lesson was his son learning from watching his father become invisible? That night, Cole was waiting for him at the apartment. Mrs. Dominguez from next door had watched him after school, as she did every day. After she left, Ray heated up leftover spaghetti while Cole did his homework. They ate dinner together, talking about Cole's day, and everything seemed normal. But after dinner, while Ray washed the dishes, Cole came and stood beside him. The boy was quiet for so long that Ray finally looked down. "Dad?" Cole said, his voice small. "Why do people treat you like you're nobody?" Ray's hand stilled in the soapy water. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he knew exactly. "I heard some kids at school talking. Their parents work at your building. They said you're just a janitor. They said it like that's something bad." Ray dried his hands slowly, buying time, trying to figure out how to answer without lying or breaking his son's heart. He knelt down to Cole's level, looking into those dark eyes that saw too much. "Because they don't know who I am. They see the uniform, and they make assumptions." "But who are you, Dad? Really?" Cole asked, and the question hung in the air like a challenge. Ray pulled his son into a hug, holding him tight. Over Cole's shoulder he could see that drawing on the fridge, the helicopter, the dream, the life he'd given up. "I'm your father. That's the most important thing I'll ever be," Ray said, his voice thick with emotion. Cole hugged him back fiercely, but Ray could feel the questions still bubbling under the surface, the doubts he'd planted by his silence. That night, after Cole fell asleep, Ray stood at the window watching the elevated train rattle past. He thought about Veronica Chase's mocking smile, about the laughter in that lobby, about the way the other employees had looked at him. He thought about the Bell 429 on that rooftop, about who he used to be before everything fell apart. Captain Raymond Fletcher, 12 years of service, 2,300 hours of flight time, 3 deployments. The man who'd been decorated for valor, who'd saved lives, who'd been somebody. But that man had made a promise to his dying wife. "Take care of our boy, Ray. No more risks, no more danger, just be there for him," Laura had said, her hand cold in his. And he had kept that promise, leaving the service with an honorable discharge, trading his flight suit for a janitor's uniform. He'd chosen invisibility over identity, safety over self, believing it was the right choice. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, his son had asked who he really was, and Ray didn't have a good answer. Ray made a decision then that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He wasn't going to let Veronica Chase's mockery stand. He wasn't going to teach his son that humiliation was something you just accepted. He was going to fly that helicopter, not for Veronica or the company, but for Cole. To show his son that they weren't nobody, that the uniform someone wore didn't define their worth. Ray walked to the kitchenette and pulled out his phone, typing out a text to Harry. "I'll do it. I'll take her challenge." The response came back almost immediately. "About damn time. I'll have keys for you tomorrow. Make them see you, Ray." Ray set the phone down, his hands trembling slightly. What had he just committed to? It had been 6 years since he'd flown. 6 years since he'd trusted himself with that kind of responsibility. But this was different. This wasn't a mission with lives on the line. This was just proving a point, showing his son that fear didn't have to win. For Cole, Ray would do anything. The next day started like any other, but everything felt different now, charged with purpose. At 10 o'clock, during his morning break, Ray found Harry in the maintenance office. The older man looked up with a knowing smile. "So you're really doing this?" Harry said, and it wasn't a question. Ray nodded, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm really doing this." Harry pulled keys from his desk drawer and slid them across. "Rooftop access and the helicopter. Don't ask me how I got them." Ray pocketed the keys, feeling their weight. "When?" Harry asked. "Friday. I need a few days to prepare. That gives me 3 nights." Ray said. Harry nodded approvingly. "Tell her tomorrow. Make it public, just like she made your humiliation public." Ray left the office and went looking for Veronica Chase. It took 20 minutes to find her, moving between meetings like a shark through water. Ray caught up to her in the hallway, flanked by 2 assistants. "Miss Chase!" Ray called out, his voice firmer than he expected. She stopped, turning with mild annoyance. "Oh, the janitor. What do you want?" Ray stood his ground, shoulders back, meeting her eyes directly. "I'll take your challenge. I'll fly that helicopter." Veronica's eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. Then she laughed, a sharp sound that echoed in the hallway. "You're joking." Ray's voice was calm and steady. "I'm not. Friday afternoon, 3 o'clock. In front of whoever wants to watch." Her laughter faded, replaced by something calculating. She studied him like a puzzle she couldn't solve. "You're serious," she said, and it sounded like a question even though it wasn't. "Completely," Ray confirmed. Veronica crossed her arms, wheels turning behind her eyes. "Fine. Friday at 3. But let's make this interesting." She raised her voice so passing executives slowed to listen. "If you can fly that helicopter, if you can even get it off the ground without killing yourself, I'll personally apologize to you in front of the entire company." She paused, her smile sharp. "And if you can't? Then you're fired. Effective immediately. Those are the stakes. Do you accept?" Ray thought about Cole, about the bills piling up, about the fact that he couldn't afford to lose this job. But he also thought about his son's question, about the man he used to be, about the example he was setting. "I accept," Ray said, extending his hand. Veronica shook it, her grip firm and businesslike. "Friday then, 3 o'clock. This should be entertaining," she said, walking away with her assistants. Ray stood alone in the hallway, his heart pounding. What had he just done? But it was done now, and there was no backing out. That night, after Cole went to sleep, Ray stood outside their apartment building looking up at the stars. The October air was cold, cutting through his thin jacket. Tomorrow night he'd start remembering. Tonight he'd just try to sleep. But sleep didn't come easy, and Ray lay in the Murphy bed staring at the ceiling, his mind cycling through procedures and emergency protocols. Through muscle memories and half-forgotten training that came back in fragments, in flashes of another life he'd thought was buried forever. Tuesday night, Ray told Cole he had to work late. Mrs. Dominguez agreed to stay with Cole, and Ray took the train back downtown. The Chase Aviation building was mostly empty, and security waved Ray through without question. He took the service elevator to the top floor, then found the stairwell that led to the rooftop access door. His hand shook slightly as he inserted Harry's key. The lock clicked and the door swung open, revealing stairs that climbed into darkness. Each step was an act of will. Then he was there, on the rooftop under a sky full of stars. The Bell 429 sat waiting on its helipad, white and silver paint gleaming under the lights. Chicago spread out in every direction, a constellation of windows and streetlights. The wind was stronger up here, pulling at Ray's jacket. Ray approached the helicopter slowly, his hand reaching out to touch the fuselage. The metal was cold under his palm, real and solid. He walked around the aircraft, conducting a visual inspection from habit, then unlocked the pilot's side door. The smell hit him immediately. Leather and fuel, and that indefinable scent that all helicopters had. Home. This was what home used to smell like. Ray climbed into the pilot's seat, his body remembering the movement. In front of him, the instrument panel glowed with dark screens and silent gauges. Ray's hands found the controls automatically, left hand on the collective and right hand on the cyclic. His feet settled on the anti-torque pedals, and suddenly he was back in Afghanistan, the July heat suffocating, dust thick enough to taste. The radio crackling with calls for medevac, his crew chief shouting coordinates, wounded soldiers bleeding in the back. The weight of responsibility crushing and exhilarating at once, the knowledge that he was the only thing standing between these men and death. Ray's breath came fast, his vision tunneling. The cockpit felt too small, the night too dark. His heart hammered against his ribs. He recognized it for what it was, the panic the VA therapist had warned him about. Triggers, the way trauma could ambush you when you least expected it. Ray forced himself to breathe, using the grounding technique. 5 things he could see, 4 things he could touch, 3 things he could hear. Slowly, painfully, the panic receded like a tide going out. His vision cleared, his heart rate slowed. This was the price of resurrection, Ray realized. You couldn't bring the pilot back without bringing the trauma too. Ray sat in that cockpit for 2 hours, not touching anything else, just being present with the memories and the fear. The panic came twice more, each wave less intense, and each time Ray breathed through it. Around midnight, Ray climbed out of the helicopter, his legs shaky, and locked it carefully. He went home to find Cole asleep and Mrs. Dominguez waiting. Ray thanked her and collapsed onto the Murphy bed fully clothed, asleep within seconds. Wednesday night, Ray returned to the rooftop, and this time he didn't just sit in the cockpit. He went through the pre-flight checklist from memory, his hands moving over switches and gauges. The Bell 429 was more advanced than what he'd flown in the service, but the fundamentals were the same. Ray's hands moved over the controls, and muscle memory took over. His body remembered what his mind had tried to forget, the delicate dance of collective and cyclic, the constant micro-adjustments needed to keep a helicopter stable, the way you had to think 3 moves ahead. He sat there until 2 in the morning, running through emergency procedures in his head. Engine failure, tail rotor failure, low RPM. Each scenario and its response burned into his brain from countless training flights. When Ray finally went home, his hands were steadier than they'd been in years. Thursday night was the last practice session. Ray arrived at the rooftop at 10, determination overriding exhaustion. This time he was going to start the engines, was going to hear them come to life. He went through the complete pre-flight inspection, checking fluid levels and control surfaces. Everything looked good, maintained to perfection. Ray climbed into the pilot's seat and pulled out the laminated checklist. His finger traced down the startup sequence. Battery on, fuel pump on, and his hand reached for the starter button, but then stopped. His hand was shaking again, not from panic this time, but from anticipation. This was it, the moment of truth. Could he still do this? Ray closed his eyes, and for just a moment he let himself remember. Not the trauma, not the fear, but the joy. The first time he'd soloed, the rush of lifting off, the freedom of flight, the rightness of it that nothing else had ever matched. He opened his eyes and pressed the starter. The engines whined to life immediately, that beautiful rising pitch singing in his bones. The rotor blades began to turn, slowly at first, and then faster. The whole aircraft vibrated with contained power, and Ray felt something in his chest unlock. Through the windscreen he watched the RP gauge climb. 50%, 60, 70, the numbers glowing green. At 80%, Ray heard a voice. "I'll be damned!" He looked up to see Harry standing at the edge of the helipad, his face split by a huge grin. Ray reduced throttle, letting the rotors spin down, and shut off the engines. In the sudden silence, his ears rang. Harry walked over as Ray climbed out. "You actually remember how to do this?" Harry said, his voice thick with emotion. "Some things you don't forget," Ray replied. Harry studied him in the darkness. "You've changed since Monday. You're standing taller." Ray smiled. "I'm remembering who I used to be." Harry clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. It's about time. Get some sleep, Ray. Friday's going to be a big day." Ray locked up the helicopter and headed home, sleeping deeply for the first time in 3 nights. Friday morning arrived too fast. Ray went through his usual routine, getting Cole ready for school, but everything felt surreal. Cole chatted about a field trip, and Ray tried to focus, but part of him was already on that rooftop. Ray walked Cole to the bus stop and hugged him tight. "I love you. You know that." Cole looked up, puzzled by the intensity. "I know, Dad. I love you too." Ray watched the bus pull away, then headed to work. The train ride felt longer than usual, every minute stretched with anticipation and dread. By the time Ray reached Chase Aviation, his hands were sweating, despite the October chill. The building buzzed with energy, word having spread about the afternoon's entertainment. Ray overheard snatches of conversation as he moved through his morning cleaning duties. "Did you hear? The janitor's actually going through with it. $5 says he doesn't even get the engine started. It'll be quick. He'll chicken out." Ray kept his head down, his expression neutral. Let them talk. In a few hours they'd know the truth. At noon, Ray couldn't eat, his stomach tied in knots. He sat on the loading dock, trying to breathe, trying to center himself. Harry found him there. "You ready?" Harry asked. Ray nodded. "As I'll ever be." Harry sat beside him. "I want to tell you something. When I came back from Desert Storm, I was a wreck. PTSD, nightmares, the whole package. My daughter asked me who I was one day, said she didn't recognize her own father anymore. That question saved my life because I realized I'd let the war take everything." "What did you do?" Ray asked quietly. Harry's voice was steady. "I remembered. Not just the bad stuff, but the good too. The reasons I served, the skills I had, the man I used to be. Slowly, piece by piece, I built myself back." Harry turned to face Ray directly. "You've been drowning too, hiding in that uniform, making yourself small. But today you're going to remember, and everyone who's looked through you, they're going to see." Ray felt his eyes burning. "What if I fail?" Harry's answer was immediate. "You won't." They sat in silence, then Harry stood and offered his hand. Ray took it, and Harry pressed something into his palm, a challenge coin from their old unit. "For luck," Harry said. At 2:45, the crowd began gathering. Ray left his cleaning cart in the maintenance closet and took the elevator to the ground floor. People were already streaming toward the rooftop viewing area, phones out and ready. The crowd was even bigger than Ray had expected. The entire company plus people from neighboring buildings who'd heard about the spectacle. Veronica stood at the front of the crowd, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She wore a black suit today, her hair down and softer than usual. When she saw Ray, her eyebrows rose slightly with surprise that he'd actually shown up. Ray made his way through the crowd, people moving aside to create a path. He could feel their eyes on him, could hear the whispers. Part of him wanted to run, to disappear back into invisibility. But he kept walking, one foot in front of the other, because Cole was depending on him. Ray stepped onto the helipad. The helicopter waited, its white paint brilliant in the afternoon sun. Chicago spread out below, the lake a sheet of beaten silver. The wind pulled at Ray's uniform, and for a moment he was 25 again, standing on a tarmac in Georgia about to take his first solo flight. Ray walked to the pilot's side door and opened it. The crowd went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Ray climbed into the cockpit, and he didn't look back at the crowd. His world narrowed to this seat, these controls, this aircraft. He pulled the harness tight across his chest, feeling the familiar pressure. His hands moved through the pre-flight checklist automatically, each switch and gauge exactly where it should be. Battery on, fuel pump on, avionics warming up with soft beeps. Ray took one deep breath, then pressed the starter. The engines caught immediately, that beautiful rising whine filling the air. The rotor blades began to turn overhead, slowly at first, then faster. The whole aircraft shuddered with life. Through the windscreen, Ray could see the crowd pressing forward, phones raised. He could see Veronica's face, her expression shifting from confident mockery to uncertainty. The R-up gauge climbed. 70%, 80, 90. At 100%, the helicopter was ready. Ray's left hand rested on the collective, his right on the cyclic, his feet on the anti-torque pedals. Everything felt right. Everything felt like coming home. Ray increased the collective smoothly, feeling the helicopter lighten on its skids. The nose wanted to yaw right, and his left foot automatically corrected it. More collective, and the skids lifted off the pad. Suddenly he was airborne, hovering. 5 feet, 10 feet, 15. The helicopter hung in the air, perfectly stable, responding to the micro-adjustments of his hands and feet like it was an extension of his own body. The crowd erupted in gasps and shouts. Ray barely heard them because he was focused on the aircraft. But he wasn't done. He'd promised to fly it, and he intended to show them what flying really meant. Ray pushed the cyclic forward gently, and the helicopter began to move. He transitioned from hover to forward flight, the nose dipping slightly as he picked up speed. Ray took the Bell 429 in a wide arc around the building, banking into a turn that pressed him into his seat. The city spread below him in geometric patterns of steel and glass. The lake glittered to the east, the expressway a river of cars to the west. And Ray was above it all, free, untethered, alive in a way he hadn't been in 6 years, alive in the way he'd been born to be. He brought the helicopter around for another pass, tighter this time, a banking turn at 45 degrees, the kind of maneuver that required precision and confidence. The helicopter responded beautifully, carving through the air. Ray could feel every control input, every shift in weight, every breath of wind. He was no longer thinking about what to do. He was just doing it, being it, existing in perfect flow. For his final maneuver, Ray set up for a figure-8 pattern over the building, the kind of demonstration that showed complete control. He crossed over the rooftop, rolled into a turn, came back across from the opposite direction. Then rolled into another turn, the pattern tight and controlled. When he completed the second 8, He brought the helicopter back to the helipad. The approach was perfect. Textbook. Ray reduced collective smoothly, descending at 500 feet per minute. At 10 feet, he flared slightly, killing forward momentum. At 5 feet, he brought the helicopter to a hover, holding it rock steady. Then he settled it onto the pad with a touch so gentle the skids barely made a sound. Ray let the rotors spin down before shutting off the engines. In the sudden quiet, he could hear the crowd. They were cheering. Actual cheering. Applause rolled across the rooftop like thunder. Ray sat in the cockpit for a moment, his hand still on the controls, letting it sink in. He'd done it. After 6 years, he'd flown again. And it had been perfect. Ray unbuckled his harness and climbed out, and the moment his feet hit the helipad, Cole came running. His son slammed into his legs, hugging him so tight Ray nearly fell over. "Dad! That was amazing! You were flying!" Cole said, words tumbling over each other. Ray knelt down, pulling Cole into a proper embrace. "Yeah, buddy, I was." Cole pulled back to look at his father with wide eyes. "Why didn't you tell me you could do that?" Ray smiled. "It's a long story. I'll tell you everything. I promise." The crowd was still applauding, but Ray only had eyes for his son, for the pride and wonder shining in Cole's face. This was why he'd done it. Harry pushed through the crowd, his face split by joy. But before he could reach them, someone else stepped forward. Veronica Chase moved slowly, like she was approaching something dangerous. Her face was pale, her confident mask completely shattered. She stopped a few feet away from Ray, and for a long moment she just stared. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Who are you?" Harry stepped up beside Ray, placing a hand on his shoulder. The old veteran's voice carried across the rooftop, silencing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce Captain Raymond Fletcher. United States Army Aviation, 12 years of service, over 2,300 hours of flight time, 3 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan." Harry's voice was steady and proud. "Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal with Valor Device, one of the finest helicopter pilots I ever had the privilege of serving with." The applause died away completely, replaced by shocked silence. Veronica's face went from pale to ashen. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Harry continued, his voice carrying. "Captain Fletcher left the service 6 years ago after his wife passed away. He chose to be here in this building, working as a janitor so he could be home every single night for his son." Harry turned to look at Ray, tears in the old man's eyes. He gave up everything he was, everything he'd worked for, because being a good father mattered more than being a decorated pilot. That's the man you've been looking down on. That's the man who just flew circles around your $12 million helicopter. The silence on that rooftop was absolute. Ray stood straight, his arm around Cole, and met Veronica's gaze directly. She opened her mouth twice before words finally came. "I didn't know. I never... I'm so sorry." Her voice cracked. "You never asked," Ray said quietly. "You saw a janitor and assumed that's all I was. That's all I could be." Veronica nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was wrong. I was so completely wrong. I don't know what to say, how to apologize for something like that." "You start by meaning it," Ray said. "And then you do better." Veronica turned to face the assembled employees, her voice stronger. "I owe you all an apology, too. I've been so focused on innovation, on the future, that I forgot about the people. I forgot that every single person in this building has a story, has value, has dignity that has nothing to do with their job title." She turned back to Ray. "You fulfilled your end of the challenge. I owe you my public apology, which I've just given. But that's not enough." She took a deep breath. "We have an opening in our aviation consulting department. The position pays $120,000 a year. It's yours if you want it." Ray felt Cole squeeze his hand, felt Harry's grip on his shoulder. 120,000, more money than he'd ever made, enough to give Cole everything he deserved. But Ray had learned something about himself over the past 6 years. "I appreciate the offer, Ms. Chase, but I have a counter-proposal." Veronica blinked with surprise. "Go ahead." "I'll take the consulting position, but part-time, 20 hours a week. I need to be home when Cole gets out of school. I need to make him dinner and help with his homework and be there for him. That's not negotiable." Veronica nodded immediately. "Of course. Whatever you need." Ray continued. "And one more thing. Every janitor, every security guard, every maintenance worker in this building deserves respect. They deserve to be seen. If I'm going to work here as a consultant, that culture has to change." Veronica extended her hand. "You have my word. Starting today, that culture changes." Ray shook her hand, and this time there was no calculation, just genuine remorse. The crowd began applauding again, warmer and more real. Over the next 2 weeks, Ray watched Chase Aviation transform. Veronica was true to her word, implementing new policies and increased wages for support staff. She made a point of learning the names of every janitor, every guard, every person she'd previously looked through. Ray saw her having coffee with the cleaning crew, asking about their lives. It wasn't perfect, but it was genuine. Ray started his new position the following Monday. Part-time consultant meant mornings only, which gave him afternoons with Cole. The work was interesting, challenging, engaging his mind without consuming his life. He reviewed helicopter designs, tested flight systems, consulted on safety protocols. He used the knowledge he'd spent 12 years accumulating. But the best part was the afternoons. Ray picked Cole up from school every day, and they'd go to the park or just walk around talking. Cole wanted to hear all the stories now about Ray's time in service. One Saturday afternoon, about a month later, Ray took Cole to a small municipal airport. They stood by the fence watching helicopters take off and land. "Do you miss it?" Cole asked, watching a helicopter climb into the sky. "Flying?" Ray thought about the question. "Sometimes. But I don't regret my choice. I'd make the same decision again." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Because of me?" Ray pulled his son close. "Because of you. Because being your dad is the most important thing I'll ever do." Then Cole said something that made Ray's throat tight. "When I grow up, I want to be like you." Ray smiled. "A pilot?" But Cole shook his head. "Better. I want to be someone who knows who they are, who doesn't let other people tell them what they're worth. Like you." Ray felt tears threatening, felt his heart expand. "You're already on your way, buddy. You're already on your way." They stood there together, watching the helicopters dance across the sky, father and son united. That evening, back at their apartment, Ray stood at the window while Cole did homework. They'd be moving soon to a 2-bedroom place in a better neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but clean and safe. Cole was excited about having his own room, finally. Ray looked at his reflection in the window, studying the man looking back. The same face, the same graying temples, the same weathered hands. But something was different. He stood straighter, met his own eyes without flinching. The invisible man had become visible again, on his own terms. 2 months later, Chase Aviation held its annual holiday party in the same lobby where Veronica had humiliated Ray. But it had been transformed with lights and decorations. In previous years, Ray hadn't attended, but this year he received a formal invitation. Veronica had personally asked him to come. So Ray put on his one good suit and took the train downtown. The party was in full swing when he arrived, and within minutes Ray found himself pulled into conversations, welcomed and included. Later in the evening, Veronica took the microphone. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," she began. "It's been an incredible year for Chase Aviation. We've launched new products, expanded into new markets, achieved record revenues. But the thing I'm most proud of is something you can't measure in dollars or market share. This year we learned to see each other. Really see each other. Not just as job titles, but as human beings with stories and struggles and dignity. One man taught us that lesson. Veronica's eyes found Ray in the crowd. "Ray Fletcher, would you come up here, please?" Ray's heart hammered, but Harry nudged him forward and the crowd parted. Ray walked to the stage, aware of every eye on him. Veronica smiled as he approached. "Ray, when we first met, I treated you terribly. I saw your uniform and made assumptions. I was wrong, and I'm still learning from that mistake. But here's what I want everyone to know. Ray didn't prove his worth by flying that helicopter. He had worth all along." She turned to address the crowd. "Every single person in this building has worth. The job you do doesn't define your value. Your humanity does." The crowd applauded. Veronica held out her hand and Ray shook it. Then she did something unexpected. She stepped forward and hugged him briefly but genuinely. When she stepped back, there were tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for teaching me to be better." Ray nodded, not trusting his voice, and walked back into the crowd to continued applause. Ray made his way to the balcony that overlooked the street. The cold December air hit him sharp and clarifying. He stood there watching the city lights, thinking about how much had changed. 6 months ago he'd been invisible, a man cleaning floors and keeping his head down. Now he had a career again, had purpose, had shown his son something important, that you could lose everything and still rebuild. That dignity couldn't be taken, only surrendered. That the past didn't have to define you. The balcony door opened and Veronica stepped out, wrapping her arms against the cold. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. "It's your building," Ray replied gently. "It's our building. Yours as much as mine now," Veronica said, standing beside him. "I've been thinking a lot about that day, about what you said that I never asked. You were right. I spent so long proving myself that I stopped seeing people." Ray smiled. "We all have our blind spots." Veronica turned to look at him. "You changed me. Really changed me. I learned to look at people and wonder what their story is, what they've overcome, what they're carrying that I can't see." Ray was pleased. "That's a good way to look at people." Veronica smiled. "I learned it from you. Your son must be incredibly proud of you." Ray thought about Cole. "I hope so. I'm trying to be someone worth being proud of." Veronica's voice was firm. "You are. Trust me, you are." They stood in comfortable silence, two people who'd started as adversaries and become something like allies. They went back inside, back to the warmth and noise of the party. Ray stayed another hour, then caught the train home. Cole was asleep when he got back, sprawled across the couch with a book. Ray gently covered his son with a blanket and sat in the chair across from him. He thought about everything that had happened, about the moment Veronica had mocked him, about the decision to accept her challenge, about the 3 nights on that rooftop, fighting through panic and doubt, about the flight that had changed everything. It had been terrifying and exhilarating and necessary, a resurrection of sorts, not of the man he used to be, but of something deeper. His sense of self, his dignity, his understanding that his value didn't depend on anyone else's opinion. Ray pulled out his phone and looked at an old photo of himself in his flight suit, young and confident. Then he switched to a recent photo of him and Cole at the park, both laughing. 2 different men in those photos, 2 different lives, but the same heart, the same love, the same core. Ray closed the photos and looked at his son sleeping peacefully. Tomorrow they'd go look at that new apartment with the balcony where Cole wanted to put a telescope for stargazing. They deserved to dream, deserved to reach for things beyond mere survival. The elevated train rattled past with its familiar sound, almost comforting now. Ray stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago night. Somewhere out there, a helicopter flew across the skyline, its navigation lights blinking red and green. Ray watched it until it disappeared. He didn't feel the old pang of loss anymore. Didn't feel like he'd given up something essential. He'd made a choice, and it had been the right one. Flight had been his first love, but fatherhood was his calling. And maybe he'd found a way to have both, not the way he'd imagined when he was 25, but a better way, a balanced way, a way that honored both the pilot he'd been and the father he'd become. Ray smiled and turned away from the window. He pulled the Murphy bed down, changed into comfortable clothes, and climbed under the covers. Tomorrow would be busy with apartment hunting and Cole's soccer game. The ordinary rhythms of life that he'd once found suffocating now felt like gifts, precious moments strung together into something beautiful. As Ray drifted off to sleep, he thought about Veronica's question from that day on the rooftop. "Who are you?" He finally had an answer. Not Captain Fletcher, decorated war hero, not Ray the janitor, invisible and forgotten, just Ray, father, consultant, survivor. A man who'd learned that true strength wasn't about never falling. It was about getting back up, dusting yourself off, and remembering who you were all along. A man who'd discovered that the most important flight he'd ever take wasn't in a helicopter at all, but the daily journey of raising his son with love and integrity. A man who'd proven that dignity lived not in what others thought of you, but in what you knew about yourself. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.